Blood satellite.
That I could talk about it for like 2 episodes. And I'm trying to summarize the most important parts, but it's a very, very big topic. But I kind of set the stage in the previous episode with Heartland Theory. So if people want to know a bit more about, Harold Mackinder's Heartland Theory, listen to that.
Thus the last statement in Mackinder's triad: who rules the world island commands the world. But how to control the world island in the first place? The thesis divides the supercontinent into 2 regions, the inner crescent or rimlands, and the heartland. The rimlands, consisting of Arabia, Western Europe, India, and East Asia, make up only 1/5 of the world island's area, but house 4/5 of its population. Using Mackinder's earlier logic, this region ought to be the place from which to attempt world island domination.
This book, it's titled The Russian Empire and the World, 1700 to 1917, but it actually goes back to 1600 in the book. It's subtitled The Geopolitics of Expansion and Containment by John P. LeDonne. So it's a history book that looks at Russian imperialism from the 1700s during what's called the Russian imperialist period for those few centuries. And it shows how the various points that Russia tried to expand into the space around it and the steps that were taken to contain Russian expansion leading right up to World War I. So this book pretty much ends right when World War I begins and positions that as really the shattering of the Russian Empire at the time, prior to the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire that we used to know it. So because it takes such a large scope, there's going to be some parts that we kind of gloss over. I'm going to try and deal with the broad strokes here about the relationship that Russia had to as the heartland, to the pivot area and to the frontier areas, and what various countries did to contain Russia, which was positioned to take over the entire Eurasian continent. And the story here is that it came kind of close, that it was only really on a couple of times where Germany and Britain really pushed back, but there's a time where Russia was getting pretty far. It couldn't get that far into China, for example, but it was getting there. And some would argue that we're still dealing with that power dynamic right now. Now, there are some people just at the outset that don't subscribe to the Heartland theory of geopolitics, which is fine. I'm not saying it's the be-all, end-all, because some people think this explains all power dynamics in the world. I don't think so. But I do think there's something to be said about Russia's unique position on the Eurasian landmass, the importance of that landmass. And, if you don't think it's important, it seems that America thinks it's important. It seems that the world leaders think it's important. And when I look at the outline of world events, it seems that a lot of the nations and the statesmen of the world behave as if this is a geopolitical reality. They are still, to this day, concerned with Russian containment. It seems to me that Russia is still interested in expanding its borders into the exact same areas it always was. And I think that it's easy for us to say these things are false, living in Canada or North America, but if you're in Sweden, I think you have a long time horizon in the reverse. I think you have the statesmen in Sweden and the statesmen in Poland and Ukraine have a much more distinct relationship with their neighbors that we in the Western world would. And so, that's why I wanted to start with. They seem to be acting as if this is real. So that's why I just wanted to preface it with that. So just as a refresher here on kind of what we're talking about. So it describes these things called core areas. There's a lot of language that we introduced in this book. So a core area is typically described as like a nation state or a geographical area that has enough power to affect the areas around it. Not every place is a core area. Like China would be a core area. Poland could be a core area. Historically, you can have things that are core areas that fall out of being a core area. They're no longer important, but Britain would be a core area. So it says here, core areas are defined by their location, their social and political organization, and their drive for hegemony. A core area emerges as a marginal development at the junction between the territory of two parent cultures. It emerges when an acceleration of centrifugal forces seeks to strike out an independent course in a location well suited to the exercise of power. Such a location is likely to be a center of hydrographic convergence or divergence. Power and authority can radiate from it along river networks or sea lanes, and it draws traders, churchmen, and soldiers in search of fame, wealth, and power. So a lot of these core areas or these important nations also happen to be geographically beneficial. And this is something you hear a lot in the study of political realism that, for example, like Britain has a lot going for it geographically. It's an island. That means it's very, very difficult to invade, and it means it can project power in a more effective way. Whereas if you are beset on all sides by enemies or invasive forces, it makes it very, very difficult for you to become a core area. Like some places, for lack of a better term, are sort of geographically doomed to always be invaded. And this is kind of the heart of the Heartland Theory, that Russia as a nation is very geographically advantageous, the way its mountains are laid out and the way its river networks work. It's very difficult for people to invade Russia.
We look at Russia, we see the Arctic Ocean. We know that some of their ports freeze. Some of the year, they have to go through the ice pack to get to the sea lanes of the world. If you look in front of the Ural Mountains, it's flat ground. It's flat ground all the way through the North European plain, all the way to the English Channel. And if we look at where the Baltic Sea is, and then move down through Poland, you'll find the Carpathian Mountains. Right, let's just hold that one there. The Carpathian Mountains. Now that gap there is the narrowest point of the North European plain. And it's through that gap that Russia has been invaded time and again by Poland, by Sweden, by the Lithuanian Empire, by the French in 1812, all the way to the gates of Moscow, by the Germans in 1914, and by the Germans again in 1941. So ask yourself what that does to the Russian psyche. What it does is that the Russian foreign policy looking westwards will always be to dominate that flat ground in front of them, to try to have a buffer of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, and if they can achieve it, even to have dominance over that gap, Poland. And that's why Poland disappears off the map every now and again through the centuries. It's also why Poland has its own foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia.
But the frontier area in the crescent to the south of it is full of all these other nations that are much smaller, much more decentralized, and they're much, much easier to invade. It's always been historically accurate to say that Russia is very difficult to invade. And over the course of centuries, this thing called Russia amalgamated as like a combination of like the Mongols plus the Byzantium, and it kind of crafted this new identity from the combination of these two that are very, very distinct from the West. And that's kind of how you start with. You start with that Russia can never really be part of the West because it's different, like biologically. But then you also start with like the way it kind of formed, it coalesced into a homogeneous mass in the ways that its neighbors couldn't. And that meant that it could project its power. Yeah, project its power different than China. And this is what's so interesting with Russia and China. That relationship persists to this day, because in the book it shows that over the course of these centuries, Russia was always trying to invade and take over territory and practice this sort of manifest destiny. China rarely did. China, being a core area, being very, very powerful, historically powerful, going back centuries and centuries, but it always took a defensive position. China, and why was that? Well, partly religious, partly geographically, ideologically. There's just something written in the DNA of China where it doesn't like to invade and take territory as much as it likes to kind of defend and be this sort of hermit kingdom. It's got a longer history of like shutting off the rest of the world, shutting itself off from trade, and not being as Machiavellian as the Russians. But what's interesting is the more you look back in time, the more you see that dynamic really persists to this day, and why a lot of people talk about BRICS. You've heard about BRICS, BRICS, this idea of connective tissue between India and Russia and China. And, people always say, like, if only Russia and China could partner up, they could like take over the world, or at least take over the Eurasian landmass. You've probably heard that, right? The question I ask is, well, why didn't they? Why didn't they? Like, honestly, for people who say that, people who speculate, well, why the fuck didn't they? Why didn't they for centuries? Why don't they now? They can't. No one's fucking stopping them. But the reality is, we'll get into this in the next book, that like there's just this like ancient historical barrier between them. Like they don't get along. They don't like each other. There's something there where they'll never really unify like that. Like maybe their allegiances can align every so often in very, very sparse economic ways. But like, you have to understand that the relationship between Russia and China, as outlined in this book, they've been trying to like get together for like 500 years. And China has always like fought it. They never wanted to open up trade routes. They never wanted to have a relationship with Russia. They just never did. And I don't know, like that to me, so when people say like, they talk about like a multipolar world, I'm like, there's just something, you have to understand that they don't view themselves the same way the West or Europe does. Like they really do think that they could take over the world, and that they deserve to take over the world. And I'm not trying to be anti-Russian. I'm really not. Like, to me, the purpose of like the geopolitics of containment is that everyone kind of wants to take over Eurasia. Britain wants to take over Eurasia. Like everyone does. And they're all fighting over the same pivot space. And the entire idea of this sort of geopolitics is that there's this line in the book that I just loved. It was by a British guy. His name escapes me. But he says, the frontier and the steppes, he's talking about the steppes specifically, sort of outside Russia, but he's like, it demands to be invaded. It invites the conqueror. Like this area, people talk like the Middle East, like it's always been invaded. Like there's something about it where, yes, for like a millennia, it's been invaded. There's something that empires, they want it. They'll never stop trying to invade it. And they get it for a while, then they lose it, but it's always being taken. And people laugh about that. Like America tried and Russia tried. It's like, no, they've always been trying. But there's something about this one geographic location in the world that they're always fighting over it. And once it's like this eternal battle that I think once you view it like that, it kind of changes how you view geopolitics too. It makes it like, why does America want that? Why does everyone want that? Why does everyone want it? Because there is a belief that if anyone can achieve dominance in that area, in that part of the Eurasian continent, you control the world. Because once again, it comes down to geography. It turns, if you control the Baltic Sea, if you control the Black Sea, if you control these trade routes, you can control the largest land mass on Earth. And if you control that, then the rest of the world basically falls. And at no point in human history has anyone really controlled Eurasia. Not now. People say like, oh, it's a unipolar world right now. America doesn't control Eurasia. Not really. It kind of controls Europe, but we talked about this last time. This recontextualizes the war in Ukraine, right? And still, Ukraine's always been invaded. We talked about this many, many episodes ago when we talked about the history of Ukraine, that's a long history of being passed between empires. But no one's really controlled the Eurasian landmass. But if the geopolitics of containment are to be believed, like they're always going to be trying to do that. So what do you do about that? And that was essentially that's like what World War I was about. And so the way to imagine this is like you have your core areas. These are like cultural capitals. And then radiating out from that, you have a succession of these sort of contested zones. And some of these are defined by environmental forces. Some are defined by economic or cultural forces. And these kind of change across time. These are called marginal zones. And they usually lack the resources or trade routes to like stand on their own, but they become like vassal states to these core areas. Um, and that space between core areas is called the proximate zone. This is kind of the area that they're always vying for, and it always feeds the interest of one of the core zones. And these usually define the limits of conquest, because one of the things you get into in this book is when you're talking about taking over these lands, you have what's called sort of the optimum of conquest, the optimum of expansion. And it's this sort of natural boundary to where you can't expand anymore. And a lot of things can affect that. So during Russia's period of expansion, it was, I mean, there was between 1600 and 1900, there were around, I think, 4 or 5 wars between Russia and Persia, what was known as Persia at the time, which is now known as Iran and a few other places. And a few times, like, Russia got control of Persia, but it was easy to take some of these areas, but they couldn't hold them. That's a story as old as time. Now, what makes you so you can't hold an area? Well, you can't control the people. Like, they're too alien to you. You can't understand them. This is why at various points, like, even remember we talked about the Mongols. The Mongols took over China. They couldn't hold China. China absorbed the Mongols. So there's this sort of like naturally occurring limit to conquest where one culture or one core area, even if they take an area, they'll eventually be repelled. They can't hold it, or they're too powerful. There's too many revolutions, too much pushback. So at various points, they figured out, like, hey, Persia is their line of optimum conquest. And they can only go so far south. Like, they could kind of go into, at various points, they got into Russia, not Russia, but Austria and Germany. And, you know, there is no reason to think that they couldn't take all of Scandinavia. I think they could take all of Scandinavia. Like, you know, they got Sweden for a long time, and you know, that's sort of the blood memory that a lot of Scandinavia and Northern Europe has right now. That's why they, you know, to a lot of Westerners, they don't see Russia as this thing to be wary of, but you know, that's really what they're thinking of. And there's 2 different sort of geopolitical strategies to handle borders. So you've got what's called a closed border policy, which is a hard stop on conquest, where expansion is not economically or militarily feasible. And this would be the line like between India and Pakistan. This is a hard line, or like North and South Korea. Like, this is a line, like, we're not going, anything going past here is going to be straight up war. And that's established by both sides. However, most of the world doesn't have that. A lot of the world would have what invites what's called a forward policy, which is, you know, you're encouraging incursion into, like, this is the Middle East. Like, the Middle East is always being invaded because there is no like hard military line where if you cross it, you're going to get like nukes shot at you. So a lot of the world is like that. Most of Africa is like that. These borders are very, very malleable. And so if you're a core area, you could have what's called a forward policy, where you're, unless you're told not to, you're pretty much always trying to invade these areas, is the whole thing. And that's why, like, a policy of neutrality doesn't work. We're going to get into this in the future when we talk about the book American Diplomacy by this guy named Kennan. But it's this idea that the idea of being politically neutral is kind of like a new concept. It doesn't even make sense. Or the idea of going to war to protect neutrality doesn't make any fucking sense. If you're actually looking at it from sort of like a political realist standpoint, it's like, you can only be a vassal state or you can be a core area. You actually don't have the ability to check out of that game. It's just a matter of time until you fall to something, unless you can like make a play for your own sovereignty, which can happen, which is what happened with Germany. And really this is what's so interesting about this story. The story of what really finally broke Russia was World War I and was Germany, because one of the stories in the book is that the real arc of the book was that Russia was able to invade its neighbors and these other countries because they're always so hostile with each other. And at various points in Russian history, Russia was always disorganized and disjointed. This is when the Mongols invaded. The Mongols were able to invade Russia because Russia was just these like feuding princes that couldn't coordinate to push back the Mongols. But during the imperial period, it was the opposite, where like Austria and Hungary were at odds, and the Germanic peoples were all warring with each other. And it's like, if they did unite, they could have fought Russia. And this is the story of Europe. Like, Europe was very rarely unified, and because it was always fighting itself, Russia was able to kind of take over these fringe areas. And they did it a few ways. Like with Sweden was interesting because they took over it almost diplomatically. Now, Russia was always against the Ottoman Empire. That was their big rival at the time, up until the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But a lot of their conquest is done through subterfuge and diplomacy. And he makes a point in the book by saying that a lot of even back then, because we get this idea that what was it, like fourth generation warfare and information warfare, that's sort of a modern thing. It's not. They're doing this in the 1700s. Like, Russia was known for like finding resistance movements in these countries and putting money towards them to destabilize the countries, and then move in as sort of this protector to bring stability back, as long as you rewrote the constitution to be beneficial to them. Or they had a tendency to broker deals with what he calls the men of power in countries. They did this in Persia. Like, the story of how they invade Persia, like, they would find these countries that were already sort of disintegrating from within. Then they would swoop in, make deals with the power brokers there, and then just literally what America does now. Like, America didn't invent that. It didn't invent destabilizing a country, making a deal with the guy they put on the throne that's like essentially going to make them in Russia's pocket. This backfired on them a few times, but a lot of what they did was that. But like in the case of Persia, they just couldn't hold it anyway, because, you know, they always found the thing about Russia was also that they were always staunchly Russian Orthodox Christian, and they were always against Islam. So the idea that they're always trying to like take over these areas that they were just repelled by the power of Islam. You can't rule these people with a Christian authority. And so that's one of the main reasons that, you know, that's one sort of the line of optimum conquest. You can't really just transplant a different religion on these people, which is kind of what happens in Turkey in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire. The other thing that Russia had going for it was that it was able to modernize more than a lot of other of its neighbors. So like the various core areas around Russia would have been China, Poland, Sweden, the Turks and the Persians. They're always trying to check Russian expansion, but they couldn't modernize and they couldn't unify. So because they couldn't do either of those, they really couldn't stop Russia, or Russia was able to kind of turn them against each other. You know, one great example of what Russia did was in the early 1700s. Poland was devastated in the Russo-Swedish War. So Poland was destabilized. It was really, really hurting. And they tried to elect their own king, Augustus II, who proved to be unpopular with all the dynastic landowning families in Poland. And they actually rose up against him. And so Russia, this was like the genius of them. They would always step in to mediate these conflicts. So they always had a tendency of like, oh, here's an unpopular king. All the dynasties, all the men of power are rebelling because this happened way, way more than you think. That the elites were revolting. And then Russia comes in and says, you know, we'll come in, we'll stop this civil war that's going on, as long as you, on the one condition that you let us approve your kings going forward. And so that's how essentially they took over Poland. And another thing that Russia did that proved very, very effective, there's two things. One was Napoleon. So the rise of Napoleon spooked a lot of these men of power throughout Europe. And by men of power, we mean the Ancien regime. We mean the dynastic families, the elites that Napoleon was rebelling against. And so Russia, perhaps ideologically, was able to position itself as a force of conservatism. So Russia was able to broker all these deals with the elites throughout Europe by saying that side with us and we'll stop this fucking liberalism thing. We'll stop this revolution. And you also saw the exact same thing happen during the French Revolution. Exact same thing. Russia was making a plea to all the established power brokers that we are the true conservatives. Side with us. Side with us, and we'll basically save your nations from these fucking shit libs. And that actually worked for quite some time, up until the Bolshevik Revolution, basically. And an interesting way, that's pretty much how they took over Poland too and weakened it, because during that time of the French Revolution, one of the primary concerns was fighting the export of the French Revolution all throughout Europe. And Poland was starting to adopt what was seen by outsiders as a Jacobin constitution. And a lot of these other countries were united under Russia to squash the revolution from appearing elsewhere. So this led to Russia partitioning Poland in Polish interests, because Russia had the tendency, wherever it got power, it could weaken them by saying, we're doing this for you. We're doing this to save you. So they would like partition entire countries to like stop the spread of revolution, which really only served Russian interests overall. And again, when I say this, I don't want to position Russia as uniquely evil, because again, this is something that other powerful nations do as well. And even if you don't agree with the Heartland Theory, I do think it is interesting to see it as a phenomena that like the way power operates is, you know, if you are a powerful nation, this is how Britain had to get involved, because they had said, if Russia takes over these areas, if it dominates this pivot area and takes over Eastern Europe and takes over its own southern borders, it will own all the trade, it will control the trade, and there goes the continent. So you have to give a shit. You have to contain them. And what's interesting is all these nations at various times did unify to push Russia back. And that was what happened with Germany. Because Germany, there was this cool, exciting new phenomena called nationalism that was taking over, that was uniting these Germanic peoples that were traditionally at odds.
Because in the wake of Napoleon, 300-something German states turned into like 39. And some Germans thought, in terms of maybe it should be just one German state. After all, keep in mind, nationalism is a big deal in Europe at this time. And there's a guy, Fichte, who wrote, the first original and truly natural boundaries of states are beyond doubt their internal boundaries. Those who speak the same language are joined to each other by a multitude of invisible bonds by nature herself. Long before any human art begins, they understand each other, they belong together, and are by nature one and an inseparable whole.
Russia always counted on that Austria would fight Germany. And it was okay with Germany forming this constitution and become this country called Germany, because they said, they're going to fight each other. Once Austria united with Germany to push back against Russia, that was pretty much the end of Russia. That was World War I. There was no stopping the vivacity of this thing called Germany, because now you look at Germany, its current state, it's in this severely compromised and crippled state. But there was a time when this nation called Germany appeared on the scene that seemed to have like the fucking wind of the gods at their back, and was able to unify in a way and push back this encroaching multinational empire that no one else could do. Sweden couldn't do it. Persia could. Everyone else was in disrepair. Everyone else was fighting, but Germany ended up spelling the doom of the Russian imperialist period, according to this book. And I think that's fairly accurate. But it also shows why everyone was kind of obsessed with Germany during the 19th century as well, because everyone was scared of Germany. In a sense, they still are, too. And there's a kind of a summary here that I think says it pretty well. It says, in 1700, Russia was not a threatened state. Sweden was blocking access to the Baltic by occupying the mouths of the Neva, the Nerova, and the Dvina, but had traced a line of optimum of conquest from Lake Peipus to Lake Ladoga. The sources of Russian expansion must be sought instead in the internal dynamism of the core area, in a Dew dynasty that inherited the ambitions of its predecessor and claimed the inheritance of the Teutonic Order in the west, the Byzantine Empire in the Valley of Dnieper, and the Chinggisid dynasty of the steppe from Crimea to Mongolia. So basically he was saying like what Russia is, its internal dynamic nature is a combination of Byzantium and the Mongols. That and having access to that space, that geographically optimum space, created this entity called Russia. In the formation of a strong ruling class and the consolidation of serfdom, in a political religious ideology strengthened by the schism that sanctified the secular power, in a yearning for contacts with the world of the European coastland that promised to give Russia the tools of modernization, blocked but also filtered by the Poles and the Swedes, and in a commitment to economic development and military reforms in order to gain a strategic superiority over the enemies of yesterday on the western and southern frontiers. So I just like that because it really explains like why Russia is doing this, like what sets Russia apart. Its identity, its DNA from a place like China, from the West. And so just to kind of summarize what ended up pushing back, it's that unlike Sweden and other nations, Prussia was not a core power in decline or internally combusting. It had a different sort of energy and began to expand into Germany and centralize its own power with nationalist zeal. This culminated in the Germanic unification movement, which would ultimately roll Russia back to its 1650 borders and constitute a central core power in itself. So, with the birth of this German nationalist movement, you have the birth of a core power. And Russia's hatred of Austria led it to actually be kind of okay with the unification of Germany under Otto von Bismarck, which would, they were hoping, strike a blow at France, which was one of its main rivals as a coastal power. Because that's the outline here. They always say the heartland, Russia, is always against the coastal powers. And you know, we kind of mentioned this in the last book where there are two types of warfare. Russia is land and the coastal powers are obviously ships. And they're almost like two different entities entirely. But in that sense, they're always going to see each other as rivals because they are two different entities. And so, you know, Russia was hoping, oh, we have this thing called Germany. That's going to be a problem for France. Didn't end up being a big problem for France. Because the unified Germany largely sided with Austria over Russia and become their primary opponent because everyone's looking at the same thing. They're looking at Russia saying, we don't want this huge power to expand. We can momentarily unify against them in a form of containment, which is, like we discussed in the last episode, that's all NATO really is. All NATO is there for is to contain Russia. Everyone says, oh, NATO was created during the era of the Soviet Union. You know, now that communism's over, you don't need NATO. No. You don't understand. It's to contain Russia, ancient Russia. So the Soviet Union was still ethnically and ideologically and spiritually Russian in its ambitions. That's why it keeps invading the same fucking places. Right? It has the exact same grievances with the coastal powers. Effectively, nothing has changed in this conflict. Like the Soviet Union was just a fucking rebranding. It was just like an ideological pitch shift for a minute, but it's kind of the same war going on again and again and again. And the only difference now is that the coastal powers now have America, and perhaps, you know, depending who you ask, eventually South America. That's a whole different... We'll get into that next episode about the evolution of the West writ large as a one unified, insane core area. But and just to summarize it, this is a point. If you are into political realism theory, if you're into Heartland theory, one thing that comes up a lot is historically, Europe and especially America have always been late to the game about this stuff. And that's a criticism a lot of the realist theorists talk about. Like, America, even now, thinks too ideologically, it thinks too emotionally, it thinks in like narratives, it doesn't think in political realities. And the story of Russia, like, Russia was only really contained just on the brink in like 1917 in World War One, and that's when the pushback started, as we said. But like, it could have been stopped at any point prior to that. All it needed was the coastal powers, all it needed was the rest of Europe to actually take notice into what was happening, but it couldn't, because they're always fighting each other. But once they kind of figured that out, that sort of ushered in a new era of geopolitical realities. And one could make the claim that it was the end of isolationism. I think sort of the last across the finish line is America. Like, there's still people who believe in isolationism in America, and if you're into geopolitics, you really can't do that. And for a lot of people, especially because we live on a landmass that is separated by oceans, we like to think that everyone could just be cool with each other. But I think Europeans know that there's enough history there that they live every day the reality that there's always a war going on. There's always an expansion. There's always some geopolitical shift happening. I don't think isolationism is something that most Europeans believe in. Now, I might be wrong in that. I'm not Scottish. I'm not Spanish. I don't know what it's like, but it seems to me that for those who have an understanding of history, like, you're aware that like isolationism just seems silly. Like, you're forced to be a realist if you're Germany and you're surrounded by all these foreign countries. Canada's not surrounded by foreign countries. They're surrounded by fucking oceans. It's a completely different reality. But the era of not giving a shit of what's happening over in Lithuania or Sweden kind of died certainly in World War One, but even leading up to that, once they realized that unless we band together and stop this juggernaut from forming, like, they're not going to stop. And again, just to once again say, this isn't like positioning Russia as the villain. It's like that line he had said, where the frontier is the place that invites conquest. That's the line from the book that I love, that there are these spaces that almost, if you are an advanced society, it almost demands to be taken over, because there's another group that's going to take it over if you don't. So you almost have to, you owe it to yourself. And that's if you're not even an empire, but a core area. And what is a core area? A core area is just a unified area that's culturally and ethnically and economically unified and powerful. If you reach that level, you are forced into this game. Like, you're forced to give a shit about these frontier areas, because in this geopolitical reality, you don't get to be isolationist. You don't get to be neutral. You only get to either achieve core area sovereignty or be a vassal state of another core area. That's how it was in the 1600s, and that's kind of how it is now. Now, there's a lot I didn't get to cover, because I could spend 3 episodes on this, going into the history of Russia, getting its hooks into the Greek independence movement, the Greek nationalist movement, getting its hooks into a lot of different nationalist movements and starting political uprisings. It trying to open trade routes with China and not being able to do it, going to war with Japan and just fail. There's a lot of wars they fail. But the other thing is that, once you understand this history, you look at World War One, and you just see World War One as like the last in a line of like 25 different wars. Like, it's insane how many wars were happening at that time in the Balkans, and there was all kinds. Although he makes mention in the book that these were different kinds of wars as well. These were wars where the men of power were the ones at war. You didn't have total war. Total war came about in World War One and World War Two, where it was just everyone's involved. Civilians are being carpet bombed. The types of war you were exposed to were kind of different back then.
That was always an interesting phenomenon to me, talking to other people in our generation who consider like World War II and the Great War in the context of centuries of peace. It's like, no, actually, we've had a century of peace since then. relatively speaking. But prior to that, the only thing that distinguished them, the reason we called it the Great War, was it was the first real global total war that we'd had. We'd have like regional total wars like every fucking 8 years for 1,000 years. But like that was the first time, because of industrial technology, we even had the ability to do it. Like essentially electricity and the telegraph and whatever else kind of allowed us to do that. But yeah, I mean, it really is a history of just constant war. So
yeah, and these were always wars largely of either conquest or of containment, even if they weren't called that. Because, and I think that's just an interesting way of looking at it, of like you need to fight these wars just to push back the inevitable growth of these core areas that you need to keep in check. And I don't think we've left that reality either. I survey the landscape of global conflicts, and I more or less see the same thing. I do, however, see the allegiances shifted, and obviously technology shifted everything. But I don't know, you still see the outline of coastal powers versus heartland. And that was the Cold War as well. And that's, kind of what you see here. With China just lingering on the edges, always lingering, always just there. People for like 700 years, people have been like, "Don't fuck with China," but China never really fucks with anyone. But they're there, and everyone's kind of nervous about China. and everyone sees China, like even going back to like 1700s, like Russia was determined to open up trade routes with China. Like they wanted so desperately to trade in furs and stuff like that because that's all they could trade in. And China's just like, no, we don't want to. We're going to build. We're just into building walls right now. Anyway, we went on a bit longer, but I hope I got the point across. These are, we discussed Heartland Theory last episode. These are the actual wars and the actual time frame of what built the history that built this idea of Heartland Theory. It's not just looking at a map and drawing lines. It's that this was the lived relationship of these nations for like 400 years, and it's still kind of happening. Anyway,
do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.